for the sponsorship and for your good wishes. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see everyone here this morning. Family March, good morning. Morning, Elian. Nice to see you. David Fischel, Michael Gross, lots of our regulars. I'd like to try this morning and combine maybe our theme of topics in Sefer Bereshis together with some Chanukah ideas. One of the themes in Sefer Bereshis, which is something I will develop in a future share a bit more detail, is the theme that is referred to in the Rishonim as Maisa Ovois Siman Labonim. And this is really, if there are any real themes that go all the way through the book of Bereshis, this must be considered one of the primary themes. What does it mean, Maisa Ovois Siman Labonim? So on a simple level, it simply means that later historical events for the Jewish people resembled some of the events that happened to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in the book of Bereshis. And there is a similarity between the two. It's a simon, but in actual fact, it means it's much more than that. That actually the Ovos, in many ways, Chazal understood that they bequeathed to the Jewish people certain deep inner strengths and the ability to overcome difficulties. And we are, in many ways, following the heritage of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in every century, in every generation. Maisa Ovois Siman Labonim doesn't just mean that there are certain structural similarities between the events of the Jewish people and the book of Bereshis, but it means in some way that the book of Bereshis, to use a modern scientific metaphor, that the Sefer Bereshis is in some way the DNA of the seed that will grow later on into Am Yisrael. And Am Yisrael didn't come from nowhere. Am Yisrael grew out of the seed that was planted by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Yosef, and in the events of Book of Bereshis describe to us what the DNA of Klal Yisrael is, and therefore, so I want to show you some references to that. I also like to have a look at one particularly interesting theme about excuse me, particularly interesting theme regarding Chanukah, which I don't think we've looked at before in this series. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of screen sharing. Maybe I'll start with a few pictures. Pictures are always nice things to have, and just to follow up an idea that I mentioned last week. So if you remember, at the end of last week's shir, I learned with you the Chazal, where the Gemara in Masechus Shabbos, Kaf Aleph, speaks about the ideal place for putting the menorah. Not everybody can or does put it in the absolutely ideal location. The ideal location is outside your front door, facing the street. Not everyone's got a front door that faces the street. But outside your front door, facing the street, and it should be done in such a way that when you come into the house, the mezuzah is on the right and the menorah is on the left. Remember that? That was the last bit of the shir last week. And I wanted to explain to you that actually this is not just a random connection, but there are some deep connections between the mezuzah b'yamin and the menorah b'smal. And one of them I mentioned last week is the connection between the written Torah and the oral Torah. The Torah shebichtav, which is the mezuzah. The mezuzah is actually a fragment of Torah shebichtav. It's a scroll with the letters of the written Torah in it. And the menorah represents the chokhmah of Chazal. Because Chanukah is that created by Chazal, and the events of Chanukah took place during the period of the Mishnah in Bayis Sheni, during the time of Hillel Shammai and Yosef ben Yoezer, Yosef ben Yochanan. So the menorah and that combination of Tosha B'Chsav and Tosha B'Peh is what I mentioned to you last week. I'd like to show you something interesting, historically speaking, which speaks to me. and that is some of you might have been to visit Rome. And if you've been to visit Rome, yes, and anyone been to visit Rome? If you've been to visit Rome, the obvious thing for any Jewish person to visit in Rome is what? Is the Arch of Titus, right? If you've been to Rome, you have to have seen the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus is a most remarkable piece of ancient architecture, which is extremely significant for Jewish history. The Arch of Titus, just to remind you, Titus and Vespasian were responsible for the destruction of the Second Temple, and they didn't they didn't just destroy the Beis HaMikdash, they also massacred and exiled Klal Yisrael largely at that time. It was a terrible churban, a terrible, terrible churban, but they also looted all the treasures of Jerusalem, and they returned to Rome in triumph, right, with that loot. And that loot was their, if you like, the trophies of victory, right? And of all the trophies of victory that they brought with them the menorah, right? And it's an interesting thing. I mean, that we have the description of the menorah in the Torah in words, but of course the Torah is not illustrated. We don't have a picture of it. We have a description of in the Mishnah as well, but no pictures. The only single picture, it's a bit ironic, the only single real picture we have of what the menorah looked like in the Beis HaMikdash comes from the carvings on the Arch of Titus. There you have the menorah. There you have the menorah. So we know what it looked like from that piece. But of course, that Arch of Titus symbolized the defeat of the Jews. It symbolized the power of Rome crushing the Jewish people and crushing Jerusalem. And what they were celebrating was the fact that the Jewish people were finished, right? This was, in fact, not only a military victory, but also was in terms of religious philosophy and actually the foundations of the Catholic Church and Vatican City in Rome. The Vatican and Catholicism believed that actually the Jewish people were once the chosen people. They were once the chosen people, as recorded in the Chumash, but they lost it because their spiritual level deteriorated. God destroyed them, using Rome as a tool to destroy them. And the theology of Christianity is what's called supersessionism. Very cute word, supersessionism. That's a new word for your vocabulary, ladies and gentlemen. Supersessionism means the belief that Christianity superseded Judaism and that indeed the Jews were once the chosen people, but then they lost it, and then the Christians became the chosen people of God. That is a fundamental belief of many parts of the Catholic Church. I say many parts because the Catholic Church itself has got many different factors in it, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and there are different machlokes between them, between different groups, but that is, among most of them, that is a firm belief. And the Arch of Titus was, in a sense, in inverted commas, a proof that the power of Rome had crushed the glory of Jerusalem. The Jewish people were no longer, and therefore Rome could build a new religion and a new status, and the chosenness of the Jewish people was history. And in fact, that arch stood for millennia, for 2 millennia, as a symbol of the humiliation of the Jewish people. And there are all sorts of stories about various different popes who forced the Jews of Rome on a regular basis to come and meet under the arch and to be lectured by various different bishops on how the Jewish people are now subservient to Rome and to the Christians. And this arch proved in some way, was the greatest tangible proof. Because here you have the menorah in its glory, but it's not lit, and it's a trophy of triumph over the Jewish people. it was a very, very, probably in the whole world, there is no more sad, significant piece of architecture, piece of archaeology than the Arch of Titus. So I just want to show you for a second and see if I can manage this share screen. Just bear with me for 1 second. Bear with me for 1 second. Which screen do I want? Okay. Okay, can you see it? Can you see a picture? Ali, can you see a picture? Okay, this is what is the carvings on the inside of the Arch of Titus. These are Roman soldiers returning victoriously from crushing, destroying the Beis Hamikdash, and part of their loot is this menorah. And this is, so it's a symbol of, if you like, the end of the Jewish people. That's what it was supposed to be, a symbol of the end of the Jewish people. What's interesting is that if you look at the other side of the arch, the other side of the arch looks like this. Can you see another picture? Okay, so this on the other side, so you have the menorah on one side, and on the other side you have basically Titus in a chariot, accompanied by various Roman gods, right? There's a Roman goddess holding the reins of the horse, and there's a winged goddess of war behind him, and these are the pagan gods of the Romans. So you have here a very interesting thing. You have here something very fascinating, that the I don't know what all these watchers are doing here. Okay, can't be helped. This is I just picked this off the internet, this particular picture, so you'll have to bear with me for the moment. One of the things I want to mention is something very fascinating, that if we understand what Chazal tell us, that when it comes Chanukah, we've got to have the mezuzah on the right, which proclaims Emunah, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and the negation of Avodah Zarah on the right. And on the left, we have the lit menorah, symbolizing the eternity of Am Yisrael. So this is, in fact, an exact mirror image of the Arch of Titus, which has on the right, it has an unlit menorah, symbolizing the end of the Jewish people. And on the left, it's got the Roman belief in the pagan gods of war, which have crushed the Jewish people. I find the symmetry of it is very fascinating. The symmetry is very, very interesting, that you can have that Chazal tell us to light the menorah in this particular way together with the mezuzah, and that arch somehow is exactly what when we light the menorah, we have the mezuzah in the Jewish home, what we are doing is we are, if you like, refuting. It's a refutation of the Arch of Titus. That's what it is. It's a refutation of the Arch of Titus, and in some way gives us the exact opposite message, right? That arch wanted to show that the Jewish people had come to an end. And what's interesting is that this was what they call these triumphal arches were quite common in Rome. When an army came back in triumph, right? We have one in London, in Marble Arch. We have in Marble Arch, some of you are familiar from London, there is Marble Arch. Those of you who are who've been in Paris have seen the Arc de Triomphe made by Napoleon when he came back triumphantly. So building these arches as a sign of coming back triumphant and the glory of the victorious army was a common feature in the ancient world. And this one particularly was designed to be in some way, a blunt weapon, if you like, to humiliate the Jewish people over 2,000 years. What's interesting is, I'd like you to have a look again at the this is the Arch of Titus, what it looks like, right? I want to show you, those of you who have an Israeli passport will know that on the Israeli passport, on the outside of the Israeli passport is this picture, right? This is the emblem of the state of Israel, right? I mean, on the flag is the Magen David, but the official emblem, which is on all the letterheads of the Knesset and the letterheads of the president, and on every single Tudat Oleh and every single passport in Israel, is this. Now, this menorah is an exact replica of the menorah on Titus's arch. This isn't just any old menorah. Can you see the way it's built with the base? The base and the arms exactly in this way is exactly a replica of what is on Titus's arch. So in actual fact, in 1948, when they started the Medinat Israel, they wanted to make the point that actually we are now building the state of Israel 2,000 years after Titus was successful, and we are relighting that menorah. So in some way, the menorah has represented in a very physical, dramatic way, both the fall of Israel at the Churban and in our generation, the rebuilding of Medinat Israel. I've now got a question for everybody for 5 points. What are these two branches on either side of the menorah? Anybody know? Can you see on either side of the menorah, in the emblem of the state of Israel, there are branches here.
Zechariah.
Ideas what these branches might be?
Zechariah.
Anybody know?
Zechariah.
Oh, no, very good.
The branch,
who said that?
Right? Oh, very good.
Who said Zechariah?
I did. Moshe 11.
Moshe 11. Good. This is Zechariah, right? This is the Haftarah of this Shabbos. And if you were listening to the Haftarah a few days ago,
and one represents
Kahuna,
one represents Malchus.
Right. So 1 second. Let's try this again.
There's Kahuna and there's Malchus.
1
Those
second.
are the two branches.
So these, if you have a look, I've got here somewhere on this sheet. I have here somewhere. Bear with me for a second. Come back to some of these texts in a minute. Second. Sorry. Oh, so have a look here. This is Zechariah chapter 4, right? So in the Haftarah that we read 3 days ago, Shabbos Chanukah, so Zechariah Hanavi, just 1 or 2 words about Zechariah Hanavi, right? Zechariah Hanavi historically was a colleague of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Zechariah accompanied Ezra and Nehemiah back to Shivat Zion to rebuild the Bais Sheni. Right? And the Jewish people knew that they were going to go back to rebuild the Bais Sheni because Yirmiyah Hanavi had given them a nevuah saying that after 70 years had passed, they'd be able to rebuild it. But they were very nervous about the prospect of going to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash because they thought that would entail a battle. They would have to fight against their enemies and against the Persians and everybody. So have a look here at this pasuk. So by Yoshev Hamalach Hadover Bi, so Zechariah is speaking about a vision that he gets through a malach, right? And it says by Yireni Ki Ish Sheyeh Mishan, also, and he woke me. In other words, he gave me a vision which really startled me. Vayoma Eli, and the malach said to me, Ma ata ro'eh, what vision can you see? This is a prophetic vision. And he says, V'hinei, I can see menorah zav kula, a golden menorah, v'gula arosha, v'shiva neroseo, shiva, etc., etc. I can see a beautiful golden menorah. That was his vision. But that wasn't the end of the vision. The next pasuk says, Ushnayim zeisim oleha, echad miyamin ve'echad mismal. And there were 2 olive trees, one on the left and one on the right. So ladies and gentlemen, I've got news for you. Next time you have a look, next time you handle your Israeli passport, right? Or you handle your Tudat Oleh, or you get a letter from the president and you have the emblem of Medinat Yisrael at the top, right? What you've got there is this standard. What you've got there is the menorah of Titus's arch, right, which has been relit by Medinat Israel, and it's got on the side the olive trees on either side of it, which is the nevuah of Zechariah. And the nevuah of Zechariah is about Shivat Zion, about returning to live in Eretz Yisrael. And I think it's very fascinating. I mean, most people probably, I would say 99% of Israelis who handle the Israeli passport have got no idea that of the historical significance of either this particular menorah or the olive trees on either side of it. But actually, I think this is a very interesting thought for Chanukah, is that really the way we light the menorah nowadays, especially lighting the menorah in the state of Israel, is a refutation and a reversal of what the menorah on Titus's arch was meant to show us. And I think that's an interesting, if you have a chance, you can go online and you can look up more about Titus's arch and look up more about Zechariah's olive trees. Whatever it is, I find it just very fascinating that Chazal spoke about mezuzah miyamin menorah mismol, and under the arch you have exactly the opposite, right? You have the unlit menorah as a trophy of victory against the paganism of the power of Rome. And this is really, by lighting the menorah, this is what we are addressing that, and we are in some way reversing that message. Okay, let's now move on. And second. Right. Second. We're going to move on now and have a look at something interesting from Parshas Vayechi. Now, I've given a few Chanukah shiurim recently, and I don't remember exactly whether I've learned this with you yet. But let's have a look. Let's start here because we haven't got so much time. In Parshas Vayechi, right? And anybody who's familiar with Parshas Vayechi, the very end of the book of Bereshis, we haven't quite got there yet. A few weeks' time, we find Yaakov Avinu on his deathbed, and he's giving a bracha to his children. Kol eile shiftei Yisrael shnei masa. He's got in front of him his 12 tribes. V'zos asher diber lahem avihem. And this is what Yaakov says to them. Vayivorech osam, and he gives them a bracha. And then he says an interesting line here, the last 5 words. Ish asher kebirchoso beirach osam. Right? He gave each one a blessing appropriate to him. In other words, Yaakov Avinu's brachas were not, if you like, generic blessings that everybody was given a bracha, they should be safe and secure and successful and everything. But each one, Yaakov Avinu, through his Ruach HaKodesh, he understood the power, the unique power of each different Shevet, and each different Shevet had a unique contribution to make to the Jewish people. And each one was given a different bracha and different advice. Incidentally, the Mefarshim explain, if we have a bit of a deeper understanding of what the word bracha means and the concept of bracha, a bracha is meant to be a tefillah in a certain sense. You're davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that the potential that exists in this particular individual that you're blessing should prosper and develop in the best way possible. In other words, what I'm saying is that the nature of a bracha should ideally connect to the potential of a particular individual. If you have in front of you somebody who, for example, is tone deaf, it's no good giving them a bracha that you should become a violinist. You understand what I mean? You have to give a bracha which is appropriate to the potential of each individual. Everyone's got different strengths and different abilities. So the bracha simply means to grow and develop from potential to actualize the potential of the individual in the best way possible. That's the meaning of a bracha. So Yaakov Avinu takes each one of his sons and he gives them a bracha which is appropriate to each one. What I'm looking at particularly is the one about Yehuda, right? So here, when it comes to Yehuda, what does he do with Yehuda? To Yehuda, he gives Malchus. To Yehuda, he gives the role of being the Melech, being the leader, being the king, right? Usually Malchus goes to the firstborn, but we know already, don't we, in the Torah, that even though, if you like, theoretically the firstborn should be given priority, in practice, I think it's probably true to say in the Tanakh, the firstborn never gets priority. He always somehow, it's not the firstborn. There's a theory about the firstborn, but the Torah in some way contains within it a negation of the whole principle of the priority of the firstborn, right? Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't the firstborn, and David HaMelech wasn't the firstborn, and Yaakov wasn't the firstborn, and Yitzchak wasn't the firstborn. None of the great leaders of Klal Yisrael were the firstborn. So Yehuda as well, before him was Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, were all born before him, right? But they, all of them, for one reason or another, disqualified themselves from becoming the Melech. But Yehuda is given the kingdom. And here it says, here's the pasuk. So Yaakov says something very important. Lo Yosur Shevet mi Yehuda. And this phrase becomes a very significant issue studying the history of Chanukah. I'll explain in a minute. Lo Yosur Shevet mi Yehuda means, as I've translated here, the scepter of royalty. A shevet means a staff. It doesn't just mean a staff for walking with, it means a staff of office, staff of status, right? Like the mater of Moshe Rabbeinu, which he used for the Nissim. So he says, the scepter of royalty shall not depart from Yehuda. So Yaakov Avinu is giving instructions to future generations that if you've got to appoint a king, the king should come from Yehuda. And not only that, not only the kingdom, but also the mechokek. I think it's a Hebrew word, I think it's an Ivrit word as well. A mechokek. A mechokek means a legislator, right? In secular terminologies, the Knesset is a mechokek. It makes laws. From the word chok, it's the hifil of the word chok, is mechokek. Okay, so Yehuda is given this status that he has to be the king and the lawgiver in going forward, and indeed David HaMelech and all the descendants of David HaMelech are from Yehuda. There is a little bit of, I'm saying here just as a footnote, I'm not going to go into this at the moment, but there's a little bit of a topic here which is dealt with by some of the Mefarshim about why was there even a suggestion that Shaul HaMelech should be the first king of Israel. Now, Shaul HaMelech came from the tribe of Binyamin, and there's no, and Yaakov had said that the king has to come from Yehuda. Now, the truth is, Shaul HaMelech eventually loses his status, as we all know, and David HaMelech takes over from him. But why was there, if you like, why was there even a suggestion that Shaul from the tribe of Binyamin should be the king after Yaakov has said, La Yosef Shevet Yehuda? Every time you meet someone who considers themselves to be an expert in Tanakh, ask them that question. This is quite a big subject, but not for now. I'll go upon him. What is interesting here is the Chanukah story. Now, of course, we all know the Chanukah story, at least the rough outlines of the Chanukah story, that as a consequence of the victory of the Hashmonaim and Yehuda Maccabee and his merry men, right, and his forces, they established a Jewish monarchy, right? They established a Jewish monarchy, what was known as the Hasmonean dynasty, right? The kings of the Hashmonaim. Right? The kings of the Hashmonaim, later on, there were a couple of hundred years of kings from the Hasmonean dynasty, right? And from what tribe did they come? The Hasmonean dynasty. From what tribe did they come? They were Kohanim, right? Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So Matisyahu and all his 5 sons were all Kohanim, and their children were also, the whole family were Kohanim. And indeed, there are several stories in the Gemara. One of them is in Kiddushin, I think, Samach Aleph, Samach Beis, about Yanai HaMelech. One of the famous Hasmonean kings was someone called Alexander Yanai. Alexander Yanai was one of the more famous of the kings. I think he was partly famous because he married a famous woman. There are people, that happens sometimes in history, right? He married, his wife was the wife of Yanai HaMelech, and they ruled Israel for quite a few years. So Shlomtzion HaMalka, Salome, Shlomtzion HaMalka takes over as queen. And it's the first and only time in Jewish history the Jewish people are ruled by a queen. There are no other cases of queens ruling Jewish people, but this was for several years from Tzien Malka took over the Malchus. There's a story of Melech that when he appeared on occasions as the king, he would also the Malchus, very superficially, these are complicated stories, exactly how it worked, etc. But there's no question that the Hasmonean dynasty was a violation of Yaakov Avinu's instructions. Yaakov left clear instructions. Lo Yosur Shevet Yehuda. If you're going to have a king, the king has to come from Yehuda. And therefore, according to the Ramban, what they should have done was the Hashmonaim and the Maccabim, they should have won the battle. And they said, right, we've now won the battle. We've gotten rid of these wretched Yevonim. It's now time to reestablish a Jewish monarchy. Let's look for a suitable descendant of David HaMelech and put him on the throne and restart Malchus Yisrael with somebody from Yehuda. That, says the Ramban, is what they should have done, and they didn't. And this is a sorry story about power. Unfortunately, human nature is such that once a person has power, they very rarely voluntarily relinquish their power, right? There are any number of stories of presidents and prime ministers who did fantastic work, and the time has come for them to hand over to somebody else, and they just can't let go. They can't let go of the power because the power is somehow built in. Their ego has welded itself to this power. And there are some people who say this about our current prime minister in the land of Israel, but I don't comment on political issues in these shiurim. But certainly there are often people who have done fantastic things in their life and have been amazingly successful and everything, but they don't know how to hand over. They don't know how to hand over. And this also happened to Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. They attained power. They won battles. They conquered the Greeks. And then that power they should have handed over, according to the Ramban. They should have looked up Bereshis chapter 49, the instructions of Yaakov Avinu, Lo Yosor Shevet Yehuda, and handed over to somebody from Yehuda. And they didn't. Okay, let's have a close look at this. Says the Ramban. So we're looking now at the writings of the Ramban, Nachmanides, right, writing in the 12th, 13th century. So he says, V'zeh haya onesh ha'chashmonaim. The Chashmonaim were punished, says the Ramban. Okay, so this is not part of the story that we tell our children around the Chanukah menorah, but this is Chanukah story for adults. The Chashmonaim were punished. Why were they punished? Says the Ramban. Shemolchu b'bayis sheni. They took over the Malchus. They took over the royalty in the Second Temple. Says the Ramban, a very interesting thing. He says, it's a fascinating thing, he says, about them. Ki hoyu, says the Ramban, ki hoyu chasidei Elyon. A very tremendous tribute the Ramban pays to Matisyahu and the Maccabim. He says they were Hasidei Elia. They were supreme spiritual leaders. In other words, they were great spiritually inspired people, and you would have expected them to know how to conduct themselves after the war was won. That's the point that he's making. And you would have expected them after the war was won to know what Yaakov wanted from them. And he goes on to say here very beautifully, so he's still describing the praise of the Chashmonaim. He says, V'ilmolei heim, if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for these Chashmonaim, nishtakhu Torah of mitzvahs mi Yisrael. There was a danger that the whole of Torah and mitzvahs would be forgotten in Klal Yisrael, because the power of the Seleucid Greeks and the Hellenist culture was so overwhelming that had they not fought against them, there would be nothing left. And not only mitzvahs, but also Torah, because Torah hadn't been written, the Torah Shabbal Peh hadn't been written down yet. It was only existed in the minds of a small group of Talmidei Chachamim. If the Yevonim would have succeeded in killing them, it would have been the end, right? So he says there's a tremendous amount we have to be grateful for to the Chashmonaim, but at the same time, and this actually is an interesting theme, I just want to stop off for a bit, it's a theme I've mentioned before, but it's a theme worth remembering whenever we're learning Chumash, is that within the Chumash, right, the Torah never shies away from pointing out the mistakes and the flaws of even its greatest leaders. In other words, you might say, well, why don't we keep quiet about this if they did it? Why is Ramban making such a business out of it? And the answer is, this is part of the Masorah of learning Torah, that Moshe Rabbeinu was considered the greatest Novi ever, but he made a mistake, and his mistake is highlighted in the Torah. David HaMelech was the greatest king ever, but he made a mistake. And when he makes a mistake, the Torah does not give him a free pass because of his greatness to do things that he ought not have done. So the Torah in many ways highlights, if you like, the fallibility of the leaders of Klal Yisrael. It's sometimes a bit confusing, right? I think in the modern world, often biographies are written of Gedolei Yisrael, and when you read the biography, you think, gosh, these people in their whole life, they never made a mistake. They never put a foot wrong. They never had a problem. They never got angry. They never had any doubts, And I don't think it's such a big mitzvah to write those sort of hagiographic biographies where every Godel B'Yisrael is flawless and worshipful. Yeah, I think that's a mistake. It's a mistake. Every leader of the Jewish people had his amazing strengths and amazing abilities, but at the same time, because he was human, he made errors. And this idea is illustrated very beautifully in this Ramban that we're learning now. Because the Ramban is saying, look, who are we talking about? We're talking about Hasidei Elia, the greatest spiritual leaders of that generation. Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol and his sons, his 5 sons, they were people of tremendous stature, Baruchnius. And yet, after they'd succeeded in battle, they made a mistake. And their mistake was, right, this is the, let's go back to the screen again. Right? Va'afal pikein, says the Ramban, nevertheless, despite their greatness, nen she'onish gadol, they suffered a tremendous punishment. Ki arba b'nei chashmonai hazokin hachasidim shemolchu zeh achazem kol gvurosom hatzarosom naflu b'yadaveim b'chorev. So I explained it here. Sorry. They were severely punished, and all their descendants fell in battle despite their great power and success. In other words, we see that eventually there was nobody left of the Chashmonai family. Right? The family was, over the period of a few generations, was completely wiped out. And he says that was an onesh for them because they had no business taking the malchus. This is the Ramban, right? The Ramban's view of a pasuk in Vayechi and the events of the Bais Sheni. I'd like to now have a look and contrast this for a minute with the Rambam, because there's something very interesting going on here. So the Rambam, who lived like one generation before the Ramban, and the Rambam always has a view on anything which is important in Klal Yisrael. The Rambam's view is always very, very interesting. So the Rambam starts off the laws of Chanukah by giving us a brief historical outline. The Bayis Sheni, right, this all took place Second Temple period, talking about the 2nd century BCE. Keshemolchu Yavon, under the Greek Empire, Gozru Gezeiros al Yisrael. You can read the English if you like. They made decrees against the Jewish people. Ubitlu Dosam, right? They tried to get rid of their dat, of their religion, and forbade them to study Torah or do mitzvahs on pain of death. And in fact, lots of them were executed. Uposhtu Yodam b'mamonon b'noseim v'nichnasu l'heichal uportu protzos v'tzimu hataras. And also the Beis Hamikdash they desecrated. They defiled all things that were pure. V'tzalahem liYisrael ma'od, and Klal Yisrael were very suffered greatly. V'lochatzum lachatz gadol, under great pressure. Asher richem aleim elokei v'seiva shir miyod, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu came and saved them. Right? This is really he's paraphrasing the tefillah that we said this morning of Al Hanisim. Right? But I want you now to pay attention. The Rambam is now going to give us a list of the great achievements of the Chashmonaim. Look at this. V'govru b'nei Chashmonaim kohanim agdolim. The children of Matisyahu Kohen Gadol, Govru. Govru means they were successful, right? They were victorious. V'horgum, and they engaged in battle and they killed the Seleucid Greeks who were persecuting them. That's the first thing. V'oshia Yisrael miyadam, and they saved the Jewish people from under the pressure of the Greeks. And look at how he continues here. V'he'emidu melech min haKohanim, and they established a king from among themselves, from the Kohanim. They established a king. And the Rambam says this in the middle of a list of the great achievements of the Chashmonaim. He says that they established a king, min haKohanim. And this was, and he doesn't, what don't we see here in the Rambam? We don't see here any hint of criticism of the Chashmonaim that they established kings from their family. On the contrary, the Rambam praises them. V'hemidu melech min haKohanim v'chozro malchus liYisrael, and Jewish sovereignty returned. Right? Yes, al Mosayim shana ad churban Hashem. More than 200 years until the destruction of the Second Temple. Just to remind you of the dates. So we know the Bayis Sheni was destroyed in the year 70, and the Bayis Sheni was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, and this is taking place in the year roughly 165 before the Common Era. So it's about 230 years, the last 230 years of the Second Temple period. The truth is the last bit was already Herod. Herod wasn't from the Hashmonai family directly, married somebody. And all this, the history is a bit complicated. But what is the point I want to see here from the Rambam? The Rambam speaks about the Hashmonaim kings positively. He says they achieved something fantastic. What did they achieve? The Chozra Malchus Yisrael. Jewish sovereignty returned to the land of Israel. Something which didn't exist from the year 70 until the year 1948. There was no Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Right? Jewish sovereignty returned again in 1948. In our times, but the Rambam is saying that they established a king. So the question really on the Rambam is, did the Rambam not know the Pasuk in Vayechi, La Yosor Shevet MiYehuda? Did he not know there was a problem in appointing a king from a Shevet other than the tribe of Yehuda? Obviously he knew that. So why doesn't he say something critical about it? Why doesn't he say that they won the battle? Unfortunately, they took the Malchus, but they got rid of the Yevonim. He could have written it like that, but he didn't. The Rambam speaks about the great achievements of the Hashmonaim in that they established a Malchus. And this is a very interesting question. The Rambam must have taken the view that establishing that dynasty of Hasmonean kings was something justifiable, and not only justifiable, but actually worthy of praise. It was the right thing to do. And the Ramban says it was the wrong thing to do. This debate here, which is the Rambam, the Ramban, actually goes quite deep beyond the scope of this particular shir. But it's very fascinating. It's a debate about the status, really, of the Hashmonaim and whether they did the right thing or not. I'd like to suggest to you one or two. So the question, let's rephrase this as a question. The question is, what did the Rambam think justified the creation of a Hasmonean dynasty not from the tribe of Yehuda? Why did he think that was a good idea? I just want to sharpen the question a little bit. Not only were the kings not from Yehuda, but they were from the Kohanim. Now, I want to point out, this is something that we are familiar with in the modern world. We call it the separation of church and state. And people think that it was the American Constitution which legislated the separation of church and state, that the religious authority and political authority should not be vested in the same people, right? That there should be a separation between them. This became a cornerstone of modern political theory, to separate between church and state. But the origin of it was Yaakov Avinu. And Yaakov Avinu, when he gave these brachas, he said, right, Yehuda is the Melech, and the Kohanim and the Leviim, their job is to look after the Beis HaMikdash. They have the religious authorities, and Yehuda has the Malchus. So in actual fact, when the Kohanim took over the Malchus, they weren't only breaching the instructions not to give the kingdom to anyone other than Yehuda, but they were actually putting on the throne the worst possible person, a Kohen, family of the Kohen Gadol. That was actually a short circuit. Many of us who live in Israel will know that actually the mixing together religion and politics is often a bit of what the chemists call a toxic mixture. Is not often a mixture that works very well together. It's something which has to be handled with care. When religious leaders also become political leaders, or political leaders, that combination is notoriously problematic. And Yaakov Avinu realized that. But the Hashmonaim, they took over the Malchus. So I'd like to suggest to you one or two things about why might there be a justification for the Hashmonaim to take over the kingdom of Israel. So there are several different approaches to this. One of them is a bit more of a mystical approach. Chanukah2 from Lublin writes something very interesting. He says that even though the Kohanim were not supposed to take on the Malchus, but there was within the family of the Kohanim, there was a nitzotz. This is the language of the Mukubalim. There was a spark of Malchus. There was a spark of it. Why was that? He says, is because. Okay, another question for 5 points. Who did Aaron HaKohen marry? Anybody know who was the wife of Aaron HaKohen? Okay, anyone know that? You can unmute yourself.
Nachshon's sister.
What do you say?
Nachshon's sister.
Very good. Phil.
Elisheva.
You've been doing, what do you say, Michael? Somebody said
Elisheva.
something?
Yep.
Right, what was her name?
Elisheva.
Elisheva, right. Elisheva bas Aminadov, achos Nachshon. That Aaron marries the sister of Nachshon ben Aminadov. Nachshon ben Aminadov, of course, was the prince of Yehuda. right? So Rabbi Chanukah2 says, by doing that, Aaron HaKohen brought into the Kohanim family a little spark of the Malchus of Yehuda. In other words, now the truth is that the Malchus always goes through the male line, not the female line. But nevertheless, here, the mother of all the Kohanim for all future generations was from the tribe of Yehuda. And she was the sister of the prince of Yehuda, right? Nachshon ben Aminadav's sister. And therefore, that gave a justification. That's what Rabbi Chanukah2 suggests might be an explanation in the Rambam, that this was in some way a justification temporarily for the Malchus to go to the Kohanim to connect to that ancestry of the wife of Aaron HaKohen. Okay, that's one thing. But there's another very beautiful essay, which I'm just going to try and summarize in 1 or 2 minutes, written by the MS Yaakov, who I quote a few times here, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was one of the Gedolei Yisrael of the previous generation. And he writes something very interesting. He says, it's a very interesting thing to notice. He says, when the Jewish people returned with Ezra and Nehemiah to the land of Israel, right, we don't find that anybody said, wow, this is Mashiach time. We don't find that. Which is interesting because Yeshaya had spoken about Mashiach and Zechariah had spoken about Mashiach. And what was Mashiach supposed to do? Bring the Jewish people back to the land of Israel and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, right? Which is what Ezra and Nehemiah did. And yet nobody said, this is the Geula Acharona. This is the ultimate redemption. We're now in the era of Messianic period. Nobody said that. Why didn't they say that? Why is it that we don't find in all of the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah or Haggai, Zechariah, that that's what people thought was happening? The answer is, he says, because the answer is, he says, because the Malchus of Moshiach required that there would be a Melech HaMoshiach. There would have to be a king. And the king would have to be Es Tzemach David Avdecho Meherot Atzmiach. The king would have to be a king from a descendant of David HaMelech, right? But what happened when Ezra and Nehemiah came back and brought Klal Yisrael back to rebuild the Bais Sheni? Who sat on the throne? The answer is the emperor of Persia, right? It was Cyrus, right? It was under the by kind permission of the royal court of Koresh, of Cyrus, and other Persian emperors that they rebuilt the Bais Sheni. So Klal Yisrael was not sovereign in the land of Israel, and because they weren't sovereign, because they were subjected to another nation, nobody imagined for a minute this was Mashiach, because Mashiach times requires a Melech ben David, right? Says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, if the Chashmonaim would have won the battle and then done what the Ramban suggests that they should have done, which is take somebody from the house of David and put him on the throne, what would have happened? The Jewish people would have said, Mashiach, this is Messianic times. We've got Beis HaMikdash. We're back in the land of Israel, Kohanim and the Leviim and everything, and we've now got a king from the house of David. That's it. We've got a full deck. We've now achieved all the goals of the Messianic era. It's the time of Mashiach. And the Chashmonaim didn't want, and the Chashmonaim understood that this was not the case. That even though they were going to restore sovereignty to the land of Israel, they were not at all within the Messianic period, and they didn't want to confuse the Jewish people. In other words, the returning to Israel is one thing, but to say this is Yemosa Mashiach is something else. Incidentally, this comment is equally true in our day and age as well. The return to the land of Israel is enormously significant, right? To return to the land of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and Jewish sovereignty and everything. But anyone who says that this is a Yemosa Mashiach event, right, is misunderstanding the current situation. This, incidentally, is why some Rabbonim hesitate to add in the phrase what is the phrase again in the prayer for Medinas Yisrael?
Rashis Michas Goloseinu.
Yes, Reishis Tzmichas Guloseinu. There are some Rabbanim who are quite happy to make a tefillah for Medinas Yisrael, but they don't want to say Reishis Tzmichas Guloseinu, because Reishis Tzmichas Guloseinu is a theological a description of the Yemosa Mashiach, the Messianic era. And they want to keep away from Messianism. They said, let's live in Israel and be happy that we're in Israel, be happy that we're sovereign, do the mitzvahs in Israel, and connect to the land of Kedusha and the land of Yerushalayim and the Harabayas and Hebron, etc. Let's not talk about Mashiach, because talking about Mashiach can easily go wrong. Throughout Jewish history, whenever somebody said, I know when Mashiach is coming, or I know who Mashiach is, and we are now living in Yemosa Mashiach, without exception, that was always a disaster. That always ended in tears, that statement. And therefore, says Rabbi Kimche Chanukah2, the Chashmonaim were clever people. They outwitted the Greeks, they outfought the Greeks, they restored the Malchus, but then they thought about it. They said, wait a minute, we can't put David HaMelech's descendant on the throne. That would be too confusing for the Jewish people. We need to be able to restore the Malchus without anybody thinking this is Yemosa Mashiach, and that's what they did. This is Rabbi Kimche Chanukah2's interpretation of this Rambam. So you understand what we've done here? The Ramban asks the question, the Ramban makes the point, how can we square the instructions of Yaakov with the behavior of the Chashmonaim? And he concludes that they were wrong and they were punished for it. They did an Aveira. The Rambam clearly also asked himself the question, how can we reconcile the instructions of Yaakov with the reality of the Chashmonaim? But he decided that at that period in history was the right thing to do, right? And Rabbi Kimche Chanukah2's pshat, I think, is a genius pshat. He said the reason why at that point it was the right thing to do is so as not to mislead the Jewish people into a false messianism, which could have had catastrophic results. Anyhow, I'm coming to the end of the shir. I wanted to share with you this particular insight into the Chanukah story, because it has contemporary significance. And also it's interesting to see how the great Rishonim, like the Rambam and the Ramban, came to different evaluations of the Chashmonaim and arrived at different conclusions for various different reasons. And I hope you also enjoyed my little picture show of the Arch of Titus. And did you enjoy that? The Arch of Titus and the way in which we have today, in some way, refuted it completely. And they say, incidentally, that in 1948, in the establishment of Medinas Yisrael, all the Jews of Rome gathered underneath the Arch of Titus, and they sang Am Yisrael Chai. In other words, that arch has always symbolized the most powerful statement of the crushing of the Jewish people under the power of Rome. And to take that menorah and put it on the emblem of the state of Israel has been one of the most remarkable events of our lifetime, without any doubt. And to see it visually, and you can see it clearly, take out your passport and have a look at that menorah. They've actually taken graphically exactly the graphics of that menorah in the Arch of Titus. That's the menorah which is on your passport. That's the menorah which is on the emblem of the president of the state of Israel. On all his cars and all his letterheads and everything, it's got that menorah of Titus with the olive trees of Zechariah. And this is the period that we are living through. And it's worth reminding ourselves occasionally how remarkable all that is. Okay, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to, you can unmute yourselves. You want to make a final comment or some sort. I hope you've enjoyed this particular share.
Very beautiful, thank you.
I'd like to say that in addition to what you said, like, I think it's remarkable and beautiful because the state of Israel had a lot of secular foundations to it. But really this symbolizes their connection to Tanakh. They're using a pasuk in Zechariah, and this is the symbol of our people. I think it's beautiful. I wanted to ask you,
First of all, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I think it's remarkable. Whoever it was, I don't know exactly the history of it. Whoever it was who decided that that was the emblem of the state of Israel with those olive trees, I think, knew his Tanakh well, and he knew